In 1894, Valladolid, a modest colonial city in the heart of the Yucatan Peninsula, was a place where the past still lingered in every cobblestone and weather-worn wall. The air carried the scent of burning copal from the churches and the sharp tang of freshly ground maize from the bustling market. Life was slow, but beneath the calm exterior, there was a city quietly wrestling with the shifting tides of the century. The Mexican Revolution was still years away, but whispers of political unrest traveled on the wind. The old Spanish-style mansions were beginning to decay, their grandeur fading under the weight of economic hardship. Yet Valladolid's people were proud of their heritage, proud of their survival after decades of conflict, and proud of their traditions that bound them together like an unspoken oath. The city was divided not only by social class, but also by a fragile line between modernity and tradition. The wealthy elite, descendants of Spanish colonists, lived in sprawling homes with inner courtyards where fountains trickled and bougainvillea bloomed. Meanwhile, the working class, mostly of Maya descent, labored under the tropical sun in the surrounding henequen fields or sold goods in the main plaza, their lives ruled by the demands of the land. In the center of the city stood San Servacio Church, a looming reminder of Valladolid's complex history, a building as much a monument to faith as it was a monument to survival. Around it, the plaza pulsed with life. Street vendors sold fresh tamales wrapped in banana leaves. Children played tag around the stone benches, and elders sat in the shade, trading stories of the past. It was here, in this very plaza, that the gossip always began. A city as small as Valladolid didn't need newspapers to spread news. Word of mouth was faster, sharper, and often far more dramatic. And in 1894, it wouldn't be long before that gossip turned into something more, a ripple that would become a wave, and eventually a shadow that would haunt the city's archives. At the time, Valladolid was proud of its close-knit identity. Everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. There was no such thing as anonymity. A new face in the plaza drew immediate curiosity, and a new birth was practically a public event. That's why when the Salazar family announced the arrival of twin girls, the entire city took notice. Twins were considered a blessing, even a mystical sign in Maya tradition, but this time something was different. The twins, it was whispered, had been born under strange circumstances, so strange that even the local midwives avoided speaking of them openly. And yet the Salazar home appeared normal, their iron gates opening each morning to the warm light of the Yucatan sun. The girls were seen rarely, always in matching white dresses, always quiet, always watching. In those days, Valladolid was a city that believed deeply in signs. Every unusual event carried meaning, some divine, others ominous. A sudden illness, a strange dream, or an unexpected visitor could set off a chain of interpretations, especially when it involved children. And in 1894, with the city already caught between old beliefs and new realities, the appearance of the Salazar twins began to stir unease. But Valladolid was also a city where survival required discretion. People learned to keep their voices low and their suspicions quieter. It wasn't wise to accuse, to question, or to pry too deeply. The Salazars were well respected and well connected, and their secrets, if they had any, were buried beneath layers of polite smiles and carefully guarded conversations. What no one yet knew was that Valladolid was about to become the keeper of a story it would later try to erase. A story that would linger like a shadow over the plaza, over the church, over the city itself. A story locked away in government files that would be marked confidential, sealed, and forgotten. Or so they thought. Looking back now, the Valladolid of 1894 was not merely the backdrop to an unsettling mystery. It was a lesson in human nature itself, how easily truth can be buried when a community decides it is safer not to know, how silence can be louder than a scream, and how history has a way of clawing its way back into the light, no matter how tightly the lid is sealed. The city streets, its church bells, its bustling markets, they all seemed so ordinary at the time, but every brick, every corner, every whispered conversation was part of a bigger picture. And in the heart of that picture were two little girls whose very existence would challenge the boundaries of memory, morality, and the collective will to forget. In the winter of 1894, Valladolid was wrapped in a quiet, almost stubborn stillness. The cobblestone streets echoed with the clop of mule-drawn carts, and the faint smell of burning mesquite hung in the air. Life moved at a slow rhythm, unbothered by the turbulence of politics in Mexico City or the growing tensions between rural towns and the federal government. People in Valladolid valued tradition, faith, and the steady predictability of life. That predictability shattered on a cold February morning when a midwife named Dona Camila was summoned to the modest adobe home of the Velasco family. Maria Velasco, a soft-spoken woman in her late 20s, had been in labor for nearly 12 hours. Her husband, Rafael, paced outside in the courtyard, his calloused hands trembling, not from the chill, but from an unshakable sense that something was about to happen that would mark his family forever. The Velascos were known in Valladolid as good, hardworking people. Rafael ran a small grain mill, and Maria tended a small garden that helped feed not only their children, but often the poorer families in the neighborhood. They had 2 daughters already, both bright-eyed and quick to smile, but this child, or children, had been different from the start. The pregnancy was heavier, Maria's exhaustion more severe, her cravings and sickness unlike anything she had experienced before. As the night dragged into dawn, whispers began to circulate outside the Velasco home. A birth was always news in a small town, but this one had a strange energy to it. Some claimed they had seen a priest rush by in the early hours, summoned for reasons no one would explain. Others said the candlelight inside the Velasco home flickered in odd rhythms, as if the air itself were unsettled. By sunrise, a crowd had gathered discreetly along the street. They stayed silent, as if the wrong noise might break whatever invisible thread was holding the moment together. Inside, Dona Camila worked tirelessly. Her weathered hands had brought hundreds of children into the world, but she felt a tightening in her chest with this one. When the first cry came, it was quickly followed by another, and the room grew heavy with the realization that Maria had given birth to twins. But these were not twins in the way anyone expected. The first child, a boy, had a healthy weight, with strong lungs that filled the air with his cry. The second, a girl, was smaller, fragile-looking, but her eyes, open from the moment she emerged, seemed to stare not at the people around her, but through them, as if she could already see something no one else could. The shock, however, was not in their birth as twins, but in their startling resemblance, an uncanny, almost mirror-like similarity despite being boy and girl. Their facial features, the shape of their eyes, even the faint birthmark on their right temple. Everything was identical. In a time when superstition often walked hand in hand with faith, the sight of boy and girl twins that looked as though they had been made from the same mold struck something deep in the townspeople's imagination. Dona Camila quickly wrapped them, but as she handed the children to Maria, the mother noticed something else, a small, pale scar-like mark across both of their left wrists. It was faint but perfectly identical on each child. She whispered a prayer under her breath, feeling a wave of unease she couldn't explain. Word spread quickly through Valladolid. Some called it a blessing, a sign of divine favor. Others, more cautious, saw it as an omen, a warning that the Velasco twins were tied to something far greater, and perhaps far darker, than anyone could understand. The church became involved almost immediately. Father Ignacio, the local priest, visited the family within hours, offering blessings but also quietly asking questions. Had Maria experienced strange dreams during pregnancy? Had Rafael traveled anywhere unusual 9 months before? His questions, though politely asked, hinted that he feared something more than just a rare genetic coincidence. In the days that followed, strangers began appearing in town, well-dressed men who claimed to be from the capital, asking to see the twins. They spoke in low voices with the priest and left as quickly as they came, but their presence unsettled everyone. Valladolid was not the kind of place that drew attention from the outside world, yet now, because of the Velasco twins, it seemed the quiet town had been marked on someone's map. For Maria and Rafael, however, the children were simply theirs, flesh of their flesh, heart of their hearts. They resolved to raise them with love and to guard them fiercely from whatever interest others might have. But deep down, Maria knew the truth. Their birth had set something in motion, something that would not be easily stopped. Years later, when the twins could walk and speak, their uncanny bond only deepened the mystery. They often finished each other's sentences, felt each other's pain, and sometimes even claimed to have the same dreams. The scar, like marks on their wrists, never faded, as if etched there by a hand far older than the town of Valladolid itself. The birth of the Velasco twins in 1894 was not just the beginning of two lives, it was the beginning of a story Valladolid would try and fail to forget. From the moment they could walk, Mateo and Manuel, the Valladolid twins, were like reflections in a mirror. They shared the same delicate features, the same deep, set eyes that seemed to hold unspoken stories, and the same hesitant way of moving through the world. Yet anyone in Valladolid in the late 1890s could tell you they weren't just ordinary brothers. They were a mystery the town could never quite put into words. Their early years were not the warm, carefree childhood most might imagine. While other children played in the sunlit streets, the twins often remained indoors, confined to the back rooms of their modest family home. Their parents, Alejandro and Rosa, were good-hearted people, but they carried the weight of a secret too heavy to share. The boys were born under circumstances that, if revealed, could tarnish the family's name and bring shame in a time when reputations could make or break an entire lineage. It wasn't just that the twins were remarkably alike, it was that their physical resemblance bordered on the uncanny. People whispered that they moved in the same rhythm, spoke in half sentences the other could finish, and sometimes seemed to know what the other was thinking without a single glance. The priests in town called it a sign of strange providence, while old women muttered about omens and curses. School for the twins was equally complicated. Children in small towns can be cruel, and Mateo and Manuel were the perfect target. Their clothes were always clean but plain, their speech soft and measured, and their tendency to stay close to each other was interpreted as aloofness. Some classmates teased them, calling them Los Espejos, the mirrors, while others avoided them altogether. The twins learned early that the world outside their home was full of eyes, and those eyes could be unforgiving. Yet, in the quiet moments, the twins thrived in ways most never saw. At night, by the flicker of a single oil lamp, they would pore over the few books their father had collected. Stories of explorers, inventors, and great leaders who had faced adversity with unshakable courage. They didn't talk much about their own troubles. Instead, they absorbed the lessons of resilience from pages that smelled faintly of dust and time. The brothers also shared a peculiar connection with the natural world. They would slip away to the edge of the Yucatan jungle, where they spent hours watching birds weave nests, ants carry leaves in perfect lines, and the way vines curled toward the sun. Nature, they realized, didn't judge it, simply adapted and kept growing, no matter how harsh the season. Perhaps unconsciously, they began to adopt the same philosophy. Still, shadows followed them. Whispers persisted about why the twins' birth records had certain gaps, and why no one outside the family seemed to know the details of their first months. Their parents refused to answer questions directly, often changing the subject or retreating into silence. This unspoken rule, that some truths were too dangerous to reveal, became the invisible fence around their lives. But the twins, even as boys, sensed that living in shadows could be both a prison and a shield. Manuel once confided to Mateo, "They may never understand us, but we can understand ourselves, and that will have to be enough." That statement became a kind of code between them, a quiet reminder that their worth wasn't defined by public opinion. By the time they were teenagers, they had learned to navigate the complex social web of Valladolid. They avoided confrontations, offered help where it was needed, and became skilled at observing rather than speaking. In a town quick to judge, they discovered the power of listening and thinking before acting, a wisdom that would serve them well later in life. Growing up in shadows didn't break the Valladolid twins, it forged them. It taught them patience in the face of ignorance, discipline in guarding their truth, and the importance of finding light even in hidden corners. They didn't know it yet, but the strength they developed in those quiet, watchful years would one day allow them to face a truth their whole town had tried to bury, and to face it without fear. Because sometimes the shadows that shelter you in youth are the same ones that prepare you to step into the light when the moment comes. It was a quiet Sunday in the summer of 1912. The bells of Valladolid's main church rang lazily in the humid air, calling people to Mass. By then, the twins, Julio and Manuel, were 18 years old. They had lived their entire lives under the shadow of whispered gossip, strange looks, and the constant presence of their mother, Rosa, who guarded them with the devotion of a lioness protecting cubs. Despite their isolation, the twins had carved out their own little world, working together in their father's old carpentry shop, reading books passed discreetly to them by the local priest, and walking only in the less crowded alleys of the town to avoid the eyes of the curious. On that Sunday morning, everything changed. The story began the night before, when heavy rains pounded the cobblestone streets. The storm swelled the narrow streams that cut through the edge of the town, flooding several houses in the poorer quarter. By dawn, neighbors had gathered near the edge of the river, assessing the damage. Julio and Manuel, hearing the commotion, went to help, despite Rosa's warnings to stay out of public matters. When they arrived, they saw that a young boy no more than 6 years old had been swept away by the current. A desperate woman, his mother, was screaming for help. Without hesitation, the twins plunged into the murky, fast-moving water. Their bodies, which had long been the subject of quiet speculation due to a rare condition, were stronger than they looked. They fought against the current, using a wooden branch to steady themselves. Working in perfect synchronization, they reached the boy just as he slipped beneath the surface. The rescue should have been the moment the town saw them as heroes, but as the twins climbed out of the water, exhausted and dripping, the crowd fell silent, not in awe but in shock. The soaked clothes clung tightly to their bodies, revealing the truth the family had tried to hide for years. The twins were not just brothers, they were conjoined. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Children were pulled back by their mothers. Some men made the sign of the cross, as if warding off bad luck. Rosa arrived moments later, her face pale as ash, and immediately tried to shield her sons with her shawl. But it was too late. The secret was out. That afternoon, Valladolid was buzzing. In the market, in the plaza, even in the church courtyard, the same whispers passed from mouth to mouth. Some people spoke with curiosity, others with pity, and still others with cruelty. The twins, once merely mysterious figures, had suddenly become a public spectacle. For Julio and Manuel, the incident was shattering. Until that moment, they had believed they could choose the terms of their life, that they could work quietly, love quietly, and perhaps one day travel somewhere where no one knew them. Now that hope seemed to vanish overnight. They avoided going out for days, but they couldn't hide forever. Every trip to the store or the carpenter's shop felt like walking through a gauntlet of stairs. Yet the moment that was supposed to break them did something unexpected. It forced them to confront their reality openly. A week after the rescue, the priest who had always shown them kindness came to the shop. He didn't speak of shame or pity. Instead, he told them that their courage had saved a child's life, and no rumor could erase that truth. His words lit a spark in the twins. Slowly, they began to reclaim their place in the community. They continued to work, taking commissions for furniture that was sought after for its quality. Some neighbors even came to respect them, not in spite of their condition, but because of the skill, kindness, and discipline they showed. And though the incident had exposed them, it had also freed them from living behind walls of secrecy. Looking back, the flood of that day was not just a natural disaster. It was the turning point in their lives. It revealed what was hidden, not only to the world, but to themselves. The incident that could have destroyed them instead became the moment they decided to live without fear. And in the years to come, that decision would matter far more than the whispers ever did. By the summer of 1912, Valladolid had grown used to whispers about the twins. They had long since passed from being the subject of curious gossip to a darker sort of fascination, one laced with fear and resignation. Rumors told of strange illnesses in those who came too close to them, of animals avoiding their path, and of unexplainable cold drafts in rooms where they stood. But for all the mystery surrounding them, the twins had remained visible, part of the rhythm of the town, until one day they simply vanished. It began on a rainy Tuesday. The streets were slick, the clouds pressed low over the old colonial rooftops, and the marketplace bustled with the usual chatter of bargaining voices. The twins had last been seen walking side by side through the plaza, speaking quietly in a language no one recognized, though several swore it was just Spanish, spoken in a strange, mirrored way. They headed toward the old house on Cal de los Frailes, where they lived with their mother. By nightfall, the lamps in their windows remained dark. By morning, the door stood ajar, the rooms empty. Their few possessions, a pair of carved wooden toys, a cracked mirror, and a stack of old books were still there, but the boys were gone. No note was left, no sign of struggle, not even footprints outside the door. The rain had washed away any trace. The mother was inconsolable, pacing the home for days as though expecting them to walk back in at any moment. The townspeople searched the fields, the nearby cenotes, even the abandoned mission buildings on the outskirts, but the twins had dissolved into absence, leaving Valladolid with nothing but silence where once there had been unease. Months passed. The town tried to return to normal, and yet Valladolid has always been a place where the past is not easily buried. The story of the twins became a cautionary tale told to children. Don't wander off or you'll end up like them. But in 1915, 3 years after their disappearance, something resurfaced. It happened in the office of the municipal archive, a cramped room in the back of the city hall where yellowed papers and leather-bound ledgers lay stacked like forgotten tombstones. An archivist named Joaquin was tasked with cleaning out a series of sealed boxes that had been sent from the capital. Inside one, beneath a layer of brittle newspapers, he found a slim cloth-bound file labeled in neat black ink, Caso No. 27, Hermanos de Valladolid. Joaquin hesitated before opening it. The file was marked confidential, the kind of classification normally reserved for government investigations. Inside were photographs, grainy and unsettling, showing the twins at different ages, always standing perfectly parallel, their expressions blank. There were medical reports detailing peculiar biological anomalies, without elaborating, and testimonies from doctors who had visited Valladolid over the years. One chilling report, dated 1899, noted the brothers exhibit synchronized responses to stimuli as though connected by an invisible thread. Pulse rates identical, temperature identical, psychological state appears shared. The deeper Joaquin read, the stranger it became. One section contained interviews with townspeople describing the same dream. 2 boys staring at them silently from a hallway that grew longer with every step forward. Another portion suggested the twins had been under intermittent observation by a government medical committee since birth, though no official orders for such monitoring could be found. But the most unsettling part was the final entry, dated 1912, just days after their disappearance. It was a single-page memo from a man whose signature was smeared beyond recognition. Subjects retrieved, condition stable, location classified, all local records to be erased, this file to remain sealed until further notice. Joaquin's hands trembled as he closed the folder. Retrieved, not lost, not dead, taken, and yet taken by whom, and for what, remained a mystery the file refused to answer. He knew enough of politics to understand that prying further could be dangerous. Still, he could not stop thinking about it. He debated whether to share the contents with others, but in the end the file quietly disappeared again, this time into the bottom drawer of Joaquin's own desk, where it would rest for decades. Only a handful of people in Valladolid even knew it had been found. The disappearance of the twins had once been a wound in the town's heart. Now it became a locked door in its memory. Some believed they were taken for medical experiments, others that they had been sent somewhere to live under another identity. A few whispered that the boys had been dangerous, and removing them had been an act of mercy for the town. And yet, the file proved one thing: they hadn't simply vanished. Someone had decided their fate. Someone had made sure their story would fade from public view. Valladolid learned to live with that silence, but for those who had seen the file, the truth was clear. Some disappearances aren't accidents. They're decisions, and the real question is who gets to make them. That unspoken question would linger in Valladolid for the next century. In every shadowed corner, in every whisper when two brothers walked together in the street, the old fear stirred again. The idea that anyone, no matter how strange or ordinary, could one day be deemed too inconvenient for history to remember. History has a way of fading. Streets change, buildings are torn down, and memories become nothing more than whispers between generations. But some stories, those that pierce the heart and challenge the soul, do not vanish. The case of the Valladolid twins was one of them. Though the official file had been buried in government archives and the town had learned to look away, the truth remained stubborn, like a weed that grows between stones no matter how many times it is cut down. By the early 1900s, Valladolid had transformed. New trade routes brought merchants from the capital, and electricity began replacing gas lamps. Children no longer played in the same cobblestone alleys where the twins once wandered. But in quiet conversations behind closed doors, their story lived on. Some told it as a warning, others as a prayer. And in those retellings, the lesson deepened. No matter how much power tries to erase the truth, it cannot erase the conscience of a community. An elderly woman named Dona Isabel, who had been a young servant in the twins' household, was one of the last living witnesses. In her 80s, with eyes clouded by cataracts, she would sit in the plaza and tell the story to any young person willing to listen. She spoke not to entertain but to warn about how silence can become complicity and how injustice grows when good people choose not to speak. "We all saw," she would say in a trembling voice, "we all knew, and because we stayed quiet, the twins disappeared." Her words became more than an old woman's recollection. They became a mirror for the townspeople. Parents began telling their children that courage isn't always loud. It sometimes means standing alone when everyone else is looking away. Teachers used the story as a lesson in their classrooms, not about scandal or shame, but about the moral duty to protect the vulnerable, even when it risks comfort or safety. The lesson also extended beyond Valladolid. In 1957, a young journalist named Raphael stumbled upon fragments of the original police report while researching unrelated historical cases. He traveled to Valladolid and found Dona Isabel. She was frail but sharp, and she repeated the same story she had told for decades. Raphael published an article, not sensationalized but respectful, about the twins and the strange forces that led to their disappearance. The piece sparked outrage among readers in Mexico City. It didn't lead to arrests or sudden justice, but it reminded the nation that buried truths have a way of resurfacing. Even then, there were those who tried to discredit the account. Officials called it old gossip and rural superstition. But Raphael responded with something powerful. If it was only superstition, why was it hidden for 60 years? That single question became a rallying cry for those who believed in historical transparency. As decades passed, the lesson of the Valladolid twins became less about solving a mystery and more about confronting the human tendency to forget what is inconvenient. Churches used it as an example of the spiritual cost of moral neglect. Activists referred to it when speaking about corruption and cover-ups, and for the people of Valladolid, it became part of their moral identity, something they would pass on to future generations, not to reopen old wounds, but to make sure such wounds were never inflicted again. In the town's central library, a small plaque now hangs on the wall. It doesn't mention names or details, only a simple inscription: "When you see the truth, speak it. When you see injustice, stop it. Silence is also a choice." It is said that every year, on the anniversary of the twins' disappearance, candles appear near the edge of the old street where they once lived. No one knows who lights them. Some think it's a descendant of Dona Isabel. Others believe it's a silent protest by someone who still feels the weight of the town's silence. Whatever the case, the flames burn through the nights, small, flickering reminders that the story lives on, and with it, the lesson that refused to die.